Hello, coming to you from the harmonious city of board gaming, Omaha, Nebraska. Welcome to the Out of the Dust podcast. I'm your host, band leader Bryce. Tied in with the popular recurring Out of the Dust geek list on Board Game Geek. The Out of the Dust podcast is a weekly podcast that is focused on re-exploring games we played that we hadn't previously played in a year or more. Why did the game get dusty? Why did you decide to dust it off? How does the game compare to how you remembered it? Are you likely to play it more often in the future? These are the questions that we're interested in examining on Out of the Dust. This week on the podcast, episode 43. On the Out of the Dust segment, I'll bring Starfighter out of the dust, and a contributor will dust off both Gone Bananas and Quarriors. On the reaction segment, I discuss the convention pre-order system. On the What I've Been Playing segment, I review Corinth. On the Obscure Bryce Game segment, I review Nauticus. And we wrap up the episode by taking a look at game number 1 on my top 5 favorite Kickstarter countdown. I had a chance to bring Starfighter, a 2015 Starry release from one-hit wonder designer Stefan Bodin, out of the dust recently. Starfighter is a space-themed tactical card game, and I last played it 3 years, 1 month, 15 days ago. I think this is a very innovative and unique game, and I'm quite taken with the mechanics of positioning Starfighter cards in space lanes to battle opposing forces by comboing a clever set of iconographic special abilities. Every so often I bring this out of the dust to try with someone new, who inevitably doesn't care for it nearly as much as I do, and usually not at all. I really like this game, but I have yet to encounter anyone else who does. I don't know what it is about this particular game, and this particular dusty play was the same old story, with my opponent declaring at the conclusion of the game that they're okay never playing it again. But I keep the game around in the forlorn hope of someday finding an agreeable partner for it. Maybe someday? Let's see what a contributor brought out of the dust. Sharon Kahn, username Saw266, brought a couple of interesting games out of the dust last month. First up was Gone Bananas, a Spoons retheme. Sharon last played it 10 years and 22 days ago, and currently rates it a 6 out of 10. She writes, "It's been a long time since I last played this. We played it as a fun group game at a board games day while waiting for the other tables to finish. And it was a lot of fun, especially played outdoors on a patio table. Fond memories of playing this as a child. But I need to get myself some plastic bananas, so much more tactile than spoons." Next up was Quarriors, Mike Elliott and Eric Lang's successful 2011 fantasy-themed dice-building game from WizKids. Sharon last played it 2 years and 3 months ago, and currently rates it a 7 out of 10. She writes, "We used to like this, but it's just a little unsatisfying in so many ways. This play reminded me why this is on my trade list, as it ended very quickly as one person was very lucky with rolling monsters, while the rest of us just couldn't roll the right side of our dice to kill them off." Thanks for the contribution, Sharon. Would you believe I've never played Spoons? I grew up with a lot of traditional card games, but this is one that never entered my sphere of play for some reason. Reaction segment time. Origins was this previous weekend, and one thing I was wanting to keep an eye on was the new pre-order system that some publishers were test running for their new releases. In an effort to cut down on convention booth rushes and the inevitable disappointment that comes from having a limited stock, some publishers were testing an online pre-order system that would enable convention goers to reserve a copy of the new release in question for pickup at the attendees' leisure during the convention. I have mixed feelings about this, if only because there is an undeniable excitement that comes from walking very briskly into the main exhibit hall at a major convention on the first day right when the doors open. But the convenience and peace of mind the system would instill in its place is definitely worth the trade. And I could only assume that the system went off without a hitch at Origins over the weekend because I haven't heard anything to the contrary. I hope to find some reports, either positive or negative, on Facebook and on the BGG threads that originally reported the system, but there were absolutely none to be found. Since negative occurrences are much more likely to be reported than positive ones, I'm guessing everything went smoothly since neither were reported. Of course, Origins was only a test run, with a relatively small number of new releases coming out for that convention. Most publishers save their releases for Gen Con or Essen. Gen Con is coming up next, and I'm going to continue to keep an eye on this new feature and how things progress, since many publishers are planning on doing pre-orders for that convention as well. If all goes well there, many people are hoping that publishers at Essen, which is a cash-only convention, follow suit so gamers don't have to carry around loads of cash at a convention sadly notorious for theft in recent years. Plus, since games are released year-round and there are conventions year-round, maybe we'll see this policy adopted to a lesser degree for some of the more popular but comparatively smaller conventions. I'm planning on attending BGG-Con in November, and if there were some publishers who attend that convention who did a pre-order of some of their Essen-release titles, which don't typically make it to North America until very late in the year or early in the next year, at a later season American Con, that would be very exciting indeed. This week on the What I've Been Playing segment, I'm going to tell you about Corinth, the new roll-and-write game from publisher Days of Wonder and designer Sebastian Pauchon, the acclaimed designer of Jamaica and Jaipur. Sebastian also designed The River for Days of Wonder, and he's got several other titles coming out this year for other publishers. Corinth is a re-implementation of his first published game, Ispahan, one of the better-known Astari titles and one of the few Astari titles I haven't played. So no Corinth to Ispahan comparisons from me, but for what it's worth, the general consensus among reviewers who have played both is that Ispahan remains the superior game. Here's how Corinth works. At the beginning of each round, a bunch of dice are rolled and sorted by value into 6 categories from low to high. Donkeys for types of shops and gold. Then each player drafts all the dice of one value. The quantity of dice in one of these categories dictate how many spots a player can mark off on their player sheet. Each shop has several stalls divided into various numbers of spots, crossing all of them off of which will turn into a various quantity of points, depending on the number of spots and the relative value of the shop. Donkeys and gold are used to purchase buildings, which unlock special abilities for players. Alternatively, players can draft all the dice in a spot and trace a path equal to the value of the dice in the market, which is a grid of spots that grant players various benefits depending on where the path stops. At the end of the game, the player with the most points wins, of course. It's a pretty straightforward game, and that's all there is to it. Unfortunately, it's usually a pretty obvious decision on which dice a player should draft. Players can't have multiple stalls being worked on at the same time, so unless a player is going first the following round, it's always best to draft dice that enable you to complete a stall all at once. If this is not possible, stocking up on donkeys and gold is worthwhile. If nothing else is worthwhile, continue a path in the market. The game doesn't get interesting until players take a chance on spending multiple turns to complete a valuable stall. There's some satisfaction to be had in seeing these risks come to fruition, but the end result of the game does largely seem to be at the whim of the dice. It's a briskly paced game and fun enough to warrant a try, but in the midst of the roll-and-write renaissance we are currently experiencing, Corinth ultimately feels just ordinary and entirely average. There's nothing about it that makes it stand out amongst the glut of excellent roll-and-writes out there. It's a game I won't mind playing if others want to, but it's not going to be my own personal choice for the genre. It does make me more curious about its inspiration, Ispahan, though. How much better a game than Corinth is Ispahan, ultimately? I'd like to find out. Obscure Bryce Game segment time. This week on the segment, I'm going to tell you about Nauticus, an obscure Kramer and Kiesling game published in 2013 by Cosmos and never released in North America. This is one of the favorite games of my friend, Peter Evans, and since he's the only one I know who owns this, and he's the one that introduced it to me recently, I guess that would actually make this an obscure Peter game segment this week. One of the things that I really love about Kramer and Kiesling games is their innovative action selection mechanisms, and that's an element that is present in Nauticus as well. Here's how it works. Players operate shipyards and gather the components they need for their ships from actions that are randomly assigned to spaces on a circular track that dictate how many times the action can be performed. There are separate actions to build hulls, build masts, build sails, load goods, move all of these purchase items from the warehouse onto the boats, ship goods, generate income, and earn points. Each action is further divided into parts with prices that will be matched up with the different parts of the hull, different nationalities of masts and sails, and different types of goods. Players take turns selecting one of these actions, and the other players will also perform it if they wish. The player who selected the action gets a bonus of some kind, and the bonuses are randomly assigned to different actions each round. If a player doesn't wish to perform or follow the action, or can't, they can flip over one of their pass tiles instead. Not flipping over all 3 of their pass tiles during the course of a round results in a player earning some negative points. After a certain number of player count dependent rounds, players earn endgame points for the size of their completed ships and the quantities of each good they shipped. It's an intricate design, and I was very impressed with it. Because each decision must be balanced by the action itself, the bonus it gives, the prices assigned to it, and the timing of taking it, the importance of each decision is magnified so much. I love that sort of thing, but it's the sort of game you definitely want to be cautious about playing with AP-prone players. But seeing your ships come together and timing the perfect action for the perfect benefit is very rewarding. It makes the experience very worth it. My friend Peter is right when he says it's a crime this game was never released in the US. It goes on my wish list after having learned it, and I would not be disappointed if this connects with me on a future math trade or something. We continue my top 5 favorite Kickstarters I've backed countdown this week with my number 1 favorite Kickstarter I've ever backed, Apex Theropod, a dinosaur-themed deck-building game from designer Herschel Hoffmeyer and his short-lived company Die Hard Games. I almost didn't back this one, actually. There were a ton of red flags in the original campaign. Herschel was a first-time content creator, had never been involved in a Kickstarter campaign before, had never designed a game before, had a bunch of weird non-game-related stretch goals like posters and t-shirts, and hadn't even developed a set of rules for the game yet. The designer was an artist, and all there was at this point was a lot of really amazing art. Normally I wouldn't go within 100 miles of a campaign like this that was so clearly all appearance and no depth, but unsurprisingly I was ultimately unable to resist the allure of a dinosaur-themed deck-building game, crossed my fingers and backed. And that's when the drama started. Herschel wound up sending out some of the non-game-related content before the game was ready and discovered he had severely underestimated how much it would cost to ship everything. With that in mind, the plans for the other stretch goals, most notably the t-shirts, were abandoned. I hadn't signed up for any of those, so it didn't affect me, but there were a lot of disappointed backers. But I did see it as an ominous sign and started to wonder what the fate of the campaign would be. And there were a lot of other nervous backers as well. Remarkably, the game did get finished and didn't ship abnormally late. And it turned out surprisingly amazing. Players play as a different Mesozoic-era apex predator of some kind, each of which is represented by a different custom deck. This is actually a very innovative aspect for a deck builder that I hadn't seen before at that point. Each player has a personal supply of cards they deck build from instead of a common deck or a display of card options. A hunt deck is assembled from a huge selection of cards, part of which is a boss theropod that opposes the players. Between 8 or 10 playable dinosaurs, twice as many bosses, and the huge selection of hunt deck cards, the base game was hugely replayable. And then the expansion campaign came along and offered even more content, including a bunch of component upgrades. Now, this expansion campaign was when the problems really started to surface, but at the outset the designer was very helpful, even allowing me to adjust my pledge after the campaign ended to get a few more add-on items. It wasn't until he realized the factory in China had screwed up, failed to print enough of certain items, and mispackaged others, that his communication waned. Ultimately, there were some backers who received partial shipments of their pledge, or even nothing at all. I myself was in a tier of repeat backers who did not receive a promised first edition and second edition upgrade pack. Since I thought the first edition rules were superior to the second edition rules anyway, this didn't affect me much except from a completionist standpoint. And so rare were 100% complete copies of the game that those are fetching hundreds of dollars on the secondary market nowadays. And yet, despite these issues, Apex Theropod manages to be my number 1 favorite Kickstarter game of all time. The game is that good! Well, the first edition rules are anyway. The second edition rules turned a satisfying player versus game set of multiplayer rules to a player versus player elimination set of rules, which was just a silly step backwards. I have no idea why the designer thought that was a positive direction to go down, but there's nothing stopping me from playing with the superior first edition set of rules, and the solitaire variant is one of the most satisfying solitaire set of rules I've ever encountered in a game, making full use of the challenging boss predator cards. I've now played the game with each of the dinosaur decks and faced all of the bosses. I'm planning on next picking out some of my favorite dinosaur decks, like the Spinosaurus, and playing it one at a time against all of the bosses. That should keep me busy for a while. Well, that will do it for episode 43. Thanks for listening. It will be a couple of weeks until the next episode, as I am traveling next week